So, thank you for being here this afternoon with us at the .NET main forum powered by VeriSign. I am your host for this afternoon. Your normal host, Claudia Van Veen, is busy practicing with the Lords of Uptime. I hope all of you will join us for the Lords of Uptime later tonight. We're going to have a great concert. Be sure not to miss it. At the end of the session, we're actually going to play a little video, give you guys a little preview of Lords of Uptime, actually after two more sessions. So you got to stick it out a little bit to get to there. But we have a great next session that I'm very excited about. I have the distinct pleasure of having four panelists to talk with me about Domain Connect, which is very interesting. It's a panel on the emerging standard of configuring DNS. So I'm going to go ahead and take a seat over here, and I'm going to start to invite our panelists up to join me. We've got an interesting group of panelists who are innovators in the Domain Connect space. So first, let me talk about what Domain Connect is for a second. It's an open standard that makes it easier for a user to configure DNS for a domain running at a DNS provider to work with a service running at an independent service provider. The user can do so without understanding any of the complexities of DNS. This panel brings together some of the biggest companies in the domain service industry. They'll discuss the protocols, its benefits, and how the goal of creating a better experience for customers was able to bring these companies together, some of which are competitors, towards a common goal. And then we'll end up directing you to domainconnect.org if you want more information after the panel, which you probably will, because these guys are going to totally whet your appetite for some cool technology. So I would like to introduce to the stage our four panelists: Arnold Blinn, Chief Architect at GoDaddy; Pavel Kovalik, Head of Product Owners Domains at 1&1 Internet; Florentin Staffy, Principal Software Architect at Microsoft, and I apologize, Florentin, the last name is Staffy? Staffia. Okay, sorry about that. And Del Putnam, Code Wrangler at Automatic. Let's give him a round of applause. Fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I look forward to you guys giving a much better description of what Domain Connect is and why it's important than I just did introducing you guys. But maybe we ought to start by getting right down into why you guys helped the creation of Domain Connect. What triggered the creation of Domain Connect? Yeah.
I guess I'll get started since it was sort of born with us. I'm with GoDaddy, and at GoDaddy, we found our users continually struggling with the complexities of what DNS was and how to set it up for a service. So we would get a lot of calls, help me set up this website service, help me set up this email service as well. And the users just didn't understand what A records were, text records were, MX records were. So we developed an internal protocol initially that made this easier from our UI and from our control panel, where customers could one-click set up big popular services on the internet. From there, we realized that some of the settings we didn't know. Not all DNS settings are static. So we started working with some of the service providers to have a custom integration with GoDaddy to apply templates. And after we got this working in a version 1, we realized there wasn't anything particularly proprietary about what we did.
Okay.
Most of the integration was actually just standardized forms of hyperlinks, very simplistic at the API level, very simplistic RESTful calls that one or two APIs that weren't very complex. So we decided to turn it into an open standard. And we wrote up a version of it that was a little different than our internal implementation, because the internal implementation had some quirks that weren't as RESTful or weren't as friendly or didn't use standards. Once we did that, we started to convert the services over, and we realized evangelizing this to other DNS providers as well would really, we have a saying in the United States, a rising tide rises all boats. So we felt that if we just got more DNS providers, it would bring more service providers on board, and that would just help everyone. It would help users, it would help us, with the ultimate goal from our end being, if we had domain names that were being used for services, the customer, by definition, is stickier. They'll renew their domain name. And that just helps everyone. It helps the services, it helps us. So that's how the standard was born. Yeah.
That's very useful. And let me reframe the question a little bit for the rest of you. Because we do have DNS providers and service providers here. You explained how you guys identified a problem in the industry from your perspective and endeavored to try and fix it, and then focus that on the rest of the DNS and service provider market to see if you could get more people into that. Obviously, you guys needed to see some problem that was being solved for your customers in order to embrace that. And so I'd like to see what problems you were seeing in the market that this was addressing. I'd like to hear from each of you on that.
So I'll start on this. The problems that Arnold mentioned were pervasive across all our customers. Everyone was hitting the same type of issues. Okay. For us, what the standard brought was having one way where we can integrate, or having the opportunity of having one way where we integrate with the other DNS providers.
And can I pause for a second? Because Microsoft is a large organization that does a lot of things. When you're talking about your customers, can you contextualize and give me some perspective of where in the Microsoft ecosystem you are? So
I'm part of the Office 365 team. So many of our customers are just going through a rather complex onboarding system. And we want all our customers to have vanity domains or custom domains as part of their onboarding, because we believe that gives them, positions them better for success. Mm-hmm. And with that desire, we took on the daunting task of trying to simplify this for everyone. And initially we started with documentation, but it only went so far. Sure.
It's much easier when you can click a couple of buttons and have it work for you.
Yeah, we actually have hard numbers by how much is easier. We see, for example, in Domain Connect, the error rate is 1%. Everyone else going manually is double digits.
Wow.
We see that a domain can be attached within 24 hours. Without it, it takes 5 to 10 days on average. Then we see customers that are having to go through a Domain Connect experience. They're much happier. So we corroborated with what Arnold was saying and then what we see a 10 to 15% increase in adoption. So mm-hmm. Customers that have Domain Connect, they tend to bring more domains. So DNS providers will see an increase in business ROI because of that. So those will either be existing domains that they were not using, or they will be purchasing new domains. And in our service, we see a 40% reduction in support cost, and we see a 40% increase in intensity of usage.
That is huge.
Yes.
Del, I'd like to hear from you as well. And if you'd also contextualize, because Automatic does a few different things, how you interface with Domain Connect in your answer of what business problems it was solving for Automatic.
Yeah, so we, at Automatic, at WordPress.com, we both sell domains and we also provide services for people who have domains that they may not have bought at WordPress.com. And so if someone had a domain somewhere else and they wanted to use that domain for WordPress.com, it was a fairly complicated procedure to explain to someone who may, they don't even necessarily know that they want a domain. They really just want to communicate with people on the internet. And so we have a lot of documentation for that to explain how to set those records up at a lot of different DNS providers. But that only goes so far, especially with less technical users. And so I think it's really the very similar stories that we share, that this is something that just takes that burden off the user and also off of our support staff, honestly. That, like you said, clicking a button is much easier. And we're currently in the process of rolling it out with a few folks at Microsoft and some other places. But Before that, we also, similar to what Arnold did, was we implemented the open standard internally so that a user could, even if they had a domain at WordPress.com, they could still use Domain Connect. They wouldn't know it, but it's just clicking a button to set up DNS records for a variety of different services, and so it is definitely the standard is useful. I think it's useful not only for users and support staff, but it's also a nice, concise way for developers to talk to each other and share information about, well, these are the records that I need, to set up, and here's how we can communicate with each other across companies.
Great. Paul, can I get you to answer the same question from the perspective of a DNS provider like GoDaddy, if you were sharing similar experiences?
Naturally, so we are, as one as DNS provider, naturally we are kind of sharing the story of GoDaddy. So all the stories about customers and users having difficulties to set up even very simple DNS configuration, this we can only confirm. Yes? And it was kind of growing proportionally to the number of records that the user has to say and to set. And basically, once we experience about Domain Connect, we say, okay, this is a really game changer in this sense. So it really brings a real value to the customers. They can really connect their website without any DNS knowledge, which kind of is equivalent to our website builders, where you can build a website without HTML knowledge. So this was kind of matching the same customer base, which is right now addressed with all these tools, but this piece in the middle was kind of missing.
Okay. You all mentioned the idea that people were experiencing problems configuring their DNS to use services in the way that they wanted. And we mentioned documentation and trying to attack things from a documentation perspective and it not working. And you mentioned even simple DNS modifications that they needed to do not being done effectively. When you were putting together the standard, when you were working on this and trying to implement it, did you look at where people were screwing up most? Do you have information about that? I say screwing up. Maybe I shouldn't use that term. Where people were finding errors in their process.
Maybe I will start. So before we kind of concentrated on Domain Connect, we also tried to analyze the kind of problems the customers are facing. And during the user test, we were kind of surprised what kind of errors can happen. So there was everything from terminology that such instruction and one provider was using a different wording for the same field that he cannot find on our user interface. It was also the copy-paste errors that you copy-paste with a space, without a space, whatever. And so there are so many points you can fail if you are not, if you don't know what you are really doing, what these customers really don't know too much about DNS. But we said, okay, we have to do something about it. And this was exactly the time where the Domain Connect idea appeared, and it was a perfect match. It said, okay, we have to not only support it technically, but also support it evolving, support it being adopted in the market.
And so along the same lines, I think some of the other problems that we would see is that when an end user tries to configure a new service, sometimes they would inadvertently break another service that they had records set up for at their DNS provider. And so one of the nice features of Domain Connect is that it helps prevent that sort of that type of problem with conflict resolution and just some of the different features, and also just taking the user out of having to set up the equation and maybe inadvertently deleting or modifying a record that they didn't really need to delete or modify, but that, they maybe weren't aware of that when they were trying to set up the new service.
Okay, so I'd like to see if we can walk through the next question from both the DNS provider and a service provider standpoint. I'm an end user. How do I interface with Domain Connect, and do I know that I'm interfacing with Domain Connect? How is it making my life better as an end user who signs up for a domain?
I'd start from the service. I think it's a service-oriented question.
Yeah, so I'll start that one. I think, personally, I believe you should not know that you're using Domain Connect. The experience should be intuitive and simple. What you need to know is whether or not you want to enable a service. You want to do an activity that, I mean, it's about the outcome. It's not about the protocol or the API itself. It's just the users need to have that abstracted. And in Office 365, I mean, we have two main points where we ask customers to interact with the API. First, we want them to prove ownership of the domain. And usually that happens through them entering a TXT or an MX record at their registrar. We give them a string, and we say, you enter that there and just come back when you're done, and we'll verify if you enter it properly. I won't go into details. I mean, there are many ways. I mean, cut and paste errors. I mean, you didn't enter it in the right type of record, so on and so forth.
So there are still stumbling blocks to that step.
Well, absolutely. It's very simple. Just
That's without Domain Connect.
Without Domain
You
Connect.
described the version without Domain
Okay.
Connect. Yeah.
Great.
so. Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that.
When I set up my own Office 65, I did that. Okay, I did that.
So with Domain Connect, I mean, you just, depending on which type of protocol integration, if you have sync or asynchronous, currently in Office 365, we use the asynchronous implementation. You would have a logon prompt for your account, and then provide the credentials, and then it's done for you. The second step where you have to do integration is in choosing which services you want to use. In Office 365, we have 3 large services. For those, we have 10 records. 2 of them are SRV records, which are notoriously difficult to set. And though that is the step where we had the most amount of friction. It ranges, the dropout rate ranges between 20 to 35%.
Wow.
They would just, a lot of customers, they would just give up, I mean, because it would be just too complicated. But many of them will just call us. And calls are in order of many hundreds per day. With Domain Connect, the reduction in calls is 40%. So it's a huge reduction for us. And as I said, the fact that we can replicate this across to other providers, that's just, it's a done deal.
Sure. Other service provider stories around the same lines? Anything?
I mean, I think we don't have numbers yet because, like I said, we're still in the early stages of implementation. But from a user perspective, ideally, the user would not know that they are using Domain Connect necessarily. They would just see, say, I want to do this thing. They get a login prompt. They need to click accept, and that's basically it. Instead of a list of instructions, and some of which are, some users don't even know if you ask them where's your domain, who's your DNS provider. They may not even know in some cases, and this even takes care of that guesswork.
So from the DNS provider perspective, is one of the reasons why this is worth investing time and resources in exactly what they were saying with the idea that it may be that you buy a domain and you want to do it for something, and at some point it's too hard and you give up, and you don't set up your Office 365 with a domain, and you don't set up your WordPress blog with a domain. Is part of the goal to make sure that you can work with service providers and make that easier so they don't give up?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered the question as you asked it.
Damn it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, good enough.
No,
we're good.
But I'll give you a little more color. When I said this at the opening question, which is if people buy domain names and they don't use the domain name successfully, as a domain hosting and registrar company, they're not going to renew their service. They're going to churn off the service. But if somebody buys a domain name with us and they activate it with email or they activate it with a website, of course, as a hosting company and a company that sells email, we prefer that they buy those services from us, but people buy services from other companies. Sure. And we want to allow that. We want to encourage that because customers choose these other services. So the less friction in that process that's possible, the better it is. The higher the activation rate just leads to more renewals, more satisfied customers, and less churn. So at the end of the day, make it easy, one click. The customer doesn't know Domain Connect's in there. They go to a service, they go to WordPress, they say, set up my website, and they click, or they type in their domain name. Domain Connect then has a protocol that, of course, the engineers at our respective companies know about, where, in this case, Automatic would discover that GoDaddy's running the domain. That's part of the protocol. Then Automatic would present UI to the customer. Hey, your domain name's at GoDaddy. Click here if you want to set it up. They'd click there. A dialog pops up from GoDaddy. The user logs in. We say, hey, yes, hi, you do own the domain. We validate it, that you own it. And we say, do you authorize the change? You click OK, and then you're done. That's all there is to it. So the customer doesn't know Domain Connect's there, but there's a lot of work going on under the covers for Automatic to discover that GoDaddy is the registrar, and in this case, actually DNS provider, to use the correct terminology, and then to actually apply the changes. So.
Okay. Oh, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think that the only place where you actually notice Domain Connect kicking in is where Domain Connect is trying to kind of protect your service. Yeah? So we have a built-in conflict detection. So when you are trying to set up a new service, Domain Connect will tell you, okay, there is another service on this domain which may be conflicting, are you sure you want to do this change? So if the customer decides so, he's, let's say, fully informed what he's doing. But on the level of language, okay, this is a service I deactivate, this is a service I activate, he doesn't have to know too much about the DNS anyway.
Okay. Well, you've convinced me at this point that this is a very useful and interesting service. But I want to take some extra time now to try and contextualize it for the people in this room. I'm making broad assumptions here, but we're at CloudFest, so we may have a lot of cloud and web hosting provider companies in the room. Can you guys tell me what is specifically useful about Domain Connect for web hosting and cloud infrastructure providers?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you know, first of all, it's not useful to everyone here.
Okay.
If I'm a cloud provider and I'm, you know, not selling services that are attached to a domain, Domain Connect isn't interesting to me. If I'm a company that's not running DNS, then Domain Connect isn't interesting to me. But if either of those things are true, where I am selling a service that's attached to a domain, or I'm running DNS for a customer and I'm allowing the customer under normal circumstances to edit the records in the DNS, then Domain Connect is interesting to you. So there's so many broad types of businesses here at CloudFest.
Sure.
If I'm building routers, and even then I might argue Domain Connect might be mildly interesting to you. One thing we did over the weekend was we prototyped in a hackathon, in the CloudFest hackathon. We used, I mean, for those in the room who are nerds like me, we all know what I think dynamic DNS is. So this is when I'm at home and my IP address changes due to my ISP changing my IP. And a lot of home routers, for example, have built-in DynDNS support. Well, the way that traditionally worked, at least 10 years ago when this was popular, was it worked with dyndns.org to use a proprietary protocol to update an A record when your home IP address changes. Well, we prototyped a service that runs on a home PC that allows you to use Domain Connect to make that update, which means that, you know, we have to finish the service, but once we finish it, that means now my dynamic IP address in my home would work with 1&1, it would work with GoDaddy and any DNS provider, not just one that happened to evangelize a closed source protocol into a router 10 years ago. So it has benefits beyond just services and DNS providers, but it's all around DNS and DNS settings.
Okay. My expectation is that there's a significant portion of the people in the room. I can't even see faces here because of the lighting in the room. But if we want to take an informal poll of how many companies in this room work with things that are associated with domain names of the DNS, yeah, it's most of us. Yeah. Okay, so we've got some relevant information here. That's very useful. So we've established that this is beneficial. Let's talk a little bit about obstacles to adoption. Can you guys give me some color as to what the biggest obstacles are to wide adoption of Domain Connect within this industry for the types of companies that are raising their hand here?
Well, there is a good bit of work that you have to do, sort of bootstrap getting the service up and running, and we started on it I think it was about 10 months ago, something like that, and it wasn't a full-time project for us. But it was something that we were interested in working on in sort of a piecemeal fashion, and it's mostly implemented now, but we're still in the final stages of getting things up and running. But there were pieces of it that we got up and running very quickly, too. So like the pieces that we use just internally, where we're not communicating with an external DNS provider. And so I think that's probably the hardest part is just getting it sort of bootstrapped. But once it's bootstrapped, then it's then it's basically just and you want to bring on your second service provider or your second DNS provider, then it boils down to just exchanging a little bit of information and doing some testing. And so the first one, this is one of those cases where the first one is there's a large hill to climb, but then after that, it's very easy.
So I would say from our end, doing the integration with GoDaddy was about 2.5 to 3 months worth of work, and then but then doing for integration, for example, for 1.1 was much less. And just like Del was mentioning, is we foresee that as we roll this out with others, it's just going to become easier and easier. The other thing is, I mean, our implementation, you can think of it, I mean, 2-3 months is a long time, but we have today we're only supporting the asynchronous protocol, which requires OAuth, and that's where the difficulty is and slows things down. But if you do the synchronous protocol, the implementation is much shorter. Okay.
From a DNS provider perspective, take any one of these people that raised their hands. Could you give us a little perspective on what their onboarding procedure would be like in your organizations?
So if you're talking about the onboarding procedure and such, like onboarding a new service, if we are only supporting Domain Connect, it's I would say more email exchange than technical work, because technical work is like 5 minutes job. To get welcome on the email is longer than the job itself. Yeah? So it's really like this. So what we are doing is a lot of discussion to convince service providers to join the club, to support it. I think also referring to the previous question a bit, the obstacles. Yeah, we see a lot of responses the protocol is right, the idea is right, but we will wait a bit till there is a longer list of providers, so a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Yes, and I think this snowball effect is coming. We see a lot of more and more activity, more and more providers coming. So I think if we meet next year, we can say it's a standard to stay, and it's something that. But in a few years, nobody will tell, I introduced a service without it.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. And, we started talking about Domain Connect at these conferences about 3 years ago. Okay. And I actually do feel like the difference between a year ago and now, from that kind of snowball tipping point, we've reached it. Okay. Initially, the service providers would say, hey, this looks good, GoDaddy, but I'm not going to do the work just for you. And I would go to a DNS provider, and they would say, well, there's 1 or 2 services, but that's not so interesting to me. And now we're at over 20 services and almost 15 DNS providers supporting the protocol. And so that's really a nice critical mass. But I did want to get back to your question, which is what's the hurdle?
Yeah.
And I think people in the room aren't necessarily, they may not know the details of the protocol yet. There are several different levels of complexity of the protocol. So there's a very, very, very extremely simple, for services, extremely simple initial way to make the protocol work that Florentine mentioned, which is a synchronous protocol. And really all that is at the end of the day is a properly formed hyperlink from the service provider to the DNS provider. That's all it is, one HTTP GET. And the protocol's done. Now, forming that proper GET requires a couple of discovery calls, so what's the prefix of the domain or the host entry for this particular DNS provider. Does the DNS provider support Domain Connect, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, it's just a link. So getting a service on board with just that link, we have an example site, an example service that runs on the internet at exampleservice.domainconnect.org. You can look at that code, and it's probably about 30 or 40 lines of code.
Okay.
So happens to be written in Python, so if you're not a Python guy, then you'll have to figure out how to write it in your language of choice. Or I'm sure any one of us would be happy to port it for you. But the DNS provider side, I think there's a slightly larger hurdle because we need to build some UI, we need to do preferably some conflict detection, and then we have to actually translate these templates, which define a service, into the actual DNS settings. But again, if all the DNS provider's doing is the synchronous protocol, they have to build a dialog box, they have to parse the URL, and they have to parse a template and apply some changes. So I've seen this implemented in some of our brands as part of Europe in as little as 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I've seen services come on board in as little as a couple of days. So I like to say a service with synchronous can get on board in 2 days. A DNS provider can implement it in about 2 weeks. Now, when you look at the asynchronous protocol, which is a more advanced use case of the protocol that does use OAuth and allows applications of templates later, asynchronously, with respect to the user interaction. Well, now you're dealing with OAuth, and OAuth has certain levels of complexity in terms of OAuth servers, state you have to store. On the DNS side, on the service provider side, you have to, if you've never implemented OAuth, you have to figure out how to do that. You have to store access tokens persistently in your database. You have to then deal with refresh tokens. So there's a little bit more work for that. Again, I don't think it's hard work, and many companies have implemented OAuth, both on the service side and the provider side as well. So, but it is a little bit more to onboard. But I will state that then once you do the implementation, then it's a question of, the protocol is an open standard. None of us own the standard. All of us have contributed to the standard and the writing of the standard. And it's really owned by Domain Connect, not by GoDaddy, not by one-on-one, Microsoft, or Automatic. Once you implement the protocol, the onboarding and relationships between the companies is not covered by the standard. The standard just says, how should it work? But when Microsoft wants to work with us, we have a conversation. When Automatic wants to work with one-on-one, they have a conversation to establish that link. And that does take work because that's involving people, terms of how you engage, things like that. There's a process behind that.
Makes sense.
And I want to be very clear that that's very different than the protocol of Domain Connect.
I'm sort of interested in building off of what you were talking about trying to move the snowball effect, starting down that path of making it ubiquitous. And I want to know if that's being service level driven. Do you have situations where you have customers coming to you saying, we want to use your service with the Domain Connect, but my DNS provider is not listed here. Are you having that experience, and is that making it back to the DNS providers?
So we have that experience today with respect to offering instructions. We have an experience where we offer personalized instruction for specific registrars. And many customers are coming in, they're saying, well, why don't you have instructions for, I don't know, say Uno Euro or Dan Domain, so they nominate a lot of companies, and we already have like a support for 80 registrars, but the list is very long. I mean, when we look all up at companies that are coming to Office 365, there are close to 20,000 individual companies. And of course, we cannot cover them all. But that's, in a way, that's not the main the purpose of the Domain Connect should be that it should be abstracting all this out. Now, the challenge that it becomes is, well, it's going to be hard for all these companies to adopt the standard. It's going to take time. But if they do, then these issues are not going to be there.
And I don't think the users, if I'm a user and I'm using a DNS provider that doesn't support Domain Connect, I'm kind of oblivious.
Okay.
Right? Like, so the user wouldn't come to you. I don't think the user would come to you and say, hey, how come it's easy for GoDaddy, but it's hard for XYZ? Because the customer doesn't know that it's easy for GoDaddy. They're an XYZ customer. So the demand isn't from the customers. The demand is really from the service providers and from the DNS providers, making it easy for our customers, reducing our support costs, and making it so Florentine and Microsoft don't have to support instructions for 20,000 different companies with registrar settings.
Right.
Right.
Makes perfect sense.
We actually do get some of those requests, and they actually are coming from partners, because partners are much more likely to onboard domains from different registrars, and they will come to us and say, well, we have such an easy integration with GoDaddy, why don't you have it with the others?
Yeah.
Of course, it's hard.
I think even if right now the customers are not saying that, because right now only one will notice if having one domain with GoDaddy, one domain with someone else, and trying to do the same setup twice and wondering, okay, why here it's so easy, here it's strange. But once there will be more and more providers supporting, actually this experience, the difference in experience will be more noticeable for many of them, and I think that this time will come. Yeah.
Okay. We talked a little bit about reasons why organizations might decide to wait to adopt. Is one that they're looking into other options? Are there competing protocols to Domain Connect?
Well, yeah, the short answer is no, although I might as well have a little fun with the question.
Okay.
There was a protocol that was a precursor to Domain Connect that had some adoption using OAuth.
Okay.
It was developed by a very large search company based in California, and they used it.
Oh, gosh.
They used it to develop an integration with their email suite, and this was invented about 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, and it had some security problems. Okay. Was the fundamental thing, and the security problems weren't your DNS was going to get hacked. That wasn't the concern. The concern with it was really more of an OAuth consent to have access to a DNS API.
Okay.
And in opening that up to many services wasn't really tenable. That large company, we trusted them and we implemented the protocol and they never broke anything. But we couldn't open it to 100 services because then things would step on each other. So the real innovation with Domain Connect was this idea that a service is template driven. Mm-hmm. So the records that a service needs are pre-established. It's not that the service gets to set random A records, text records, and MX records. It's that the service sets these specific records. And so that company in California is actually in the process of converting to Domain Connect. So, but are there any active competitive protocols? No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Unless somebody here knows of one, but I don't.
So that then, I guess my big question is, where are we then in the evolution of Domain Connect? Are these the early days of Domain Connect?
I'd say it's just barely past the early days.
Okay.
When we first started working on it at Automatic, the spec has changed a little bit since we had started working on it, but it seems to have settled down quite a bit right now. So I think now is a good time.
I talk to you about something.
Okay, great. But even then, there's mailing lists that if you wanted to get involved in that, you can join one of the mailing lists and be a part of helping to improve the spec. Yeah.
Well, I guess let me add a little nuance. Okay, so go ahead and answer, but then maybe
the
I'll
only
throw
thing
some
that
more
I would
nuance to
add
the
is,
question.
for us, it's very early, because they are only we only have these 15 providers.
Yeah.
We want 20,000.
Great. Okay, that's great. Well, I was going to say that there are, I guess, a couple of different aspects to how early are we in the process. When it comes to mass adoption, that's one question. How early are we in the process? But then we're talking about the actual standard. Is this a standard that has things on its roadmap, and the standard itself is going to evolve and change over time? So I've got two questions when I say, are we at the early days, from a standards perspective and from an adoption perspective?
Yeah, and I probably have a slightly different perspective. I think we're a little further along, but I agree, we're maybe a couple steps past early. But maybe that's because I've been at it so long. I do think the spec, when we onboard new companies, about 1 in every 5 to 10 services throws a curveball at us of something we hadn't thought of before. And I joked around and I said, hey, I need to talk to you. So we did this hackathon, and there were 3 projects actually at the hackathon on Domain Connect. And we came out of that with 4 or 5 small changes to the standard. Wow. None of them actually break anything. So that's the good news. They're all enhancements to make things easier. I can even give you an example.
Great.
So one of the projects was the guys from Plesk integrated Domain Connect to the Plesk hosting control panel. So pretty cool project. And they implemented both the service provider and the DNS provider side. And the guy from Plesk came to me and he said, hey, Arnold, Plesk, we need to set A records and enable email and do all these things. But we also have a link to edit DNS inside Plesk. And if DNS is running off Plesk, I'd like to have a link in Plesk to the domain control panel where it actually is, not inside Plesk. So they wanted a deep link to the GoDaddy control panel. And I was like, that's a really good idea. We'd love for you to show that link in your control panel. So we want to add a link to the, getting into the detail, to that little config, like an optional link, right? So, and it would be optional. And so the spec change, I love the spec, and it's fun to work on because it changes like that all the time, but the changes are all small and they're improvements, and they're, at this point, I think we're well past where they break things, where we're changing things fundamental to the protocol, but we're adding things, we're making it better, and there's room for growth. So when people get involved in establishing the standard, I think that's the interesting thing, like the new twist. So, so I think I would characterize us, we're kind of in the early teenage years of the standard, right? We're still growing, but we're kind of an adult, right? And we're still maybe making some mistakes, but we're a competent human being now that kind of can function in society.
Great.
And we can be left alone without killing ourselves. But we're not a mature adult yet.
Great. So we're down to our last few minutes of the panel, and I'd like to give the audience a chance to answer a couple of questions. But before I do, to ask. Okay, thank you. Although they may have statements they want to make too. I'll pick a couple of 1 or 2 questions from the audience in just a moment. But before I do, I want to get back to the whole trying to move the snowball forward so that you get the snowball effect and the mass adoption that you want for this standard. And so I want to see if each one of you We'll give this group your pitch before we open it up to a quick one or two final questions from the audience.
So probably I have the best pitch because I have the numbers.
Great.
So, I mean, as a business, if you are interested about your customer satisfaction, if you're interested in growth with respect to attaching more domains and reducing cost in your operations, if you are interested in having more services be attached to your infrastructure, I mean, like Office 365 or G Suite and many other services. And if you want to see a 10 points increase in NPS, that's one answer, Domain Connect.
Yeah, and I think that those numbers are probably some of the best, that's probably some of the best selling points. But I think that it's also that anytime you have to do anything with your product that is outside of your direct control, and that you're giving a user an opportunity to make a mistake that is going to reflect poorly potentially on you, even though it's not necessarily your mistake. You know, the Domain Connect is something that can fix that and improve that user experience. So the users are happier, and your support team is happier, and then your engineers are happier too.
Great.
Yeah, so let's say, apart from these voices, I think if you want to stop writing your help articles and start writing the code, please
That's
join.
great. That's great.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, I actually think we're at that kind of over that hurdle of the chicken and an egg, the snowball. I see it happening because I see the services coming unsolicited now and saying, hey, how do I onboard with this? I see DNS. I definitely see more adoption from the service providers than the DNS providers at this point.
Yep.
So, I think there is a value prop that's important to communicate to the DNS providers, because I do get asked, well, why would I do this? All I'm doing is I'm letting other companies attach to my DNS, and I want to sell my stuff.
Yeah.
And to me, it boils down to just something very simple, which is that, which I brought up earlier, which is that we get people using domains, we'll have a more successful industry at large.
Great.
And this is a strong message at NamesCon, where it's a lot of domain name purchasing, and people buy domain names, but they never use them. Mm-hmm. And so getting that attach is what sustains that business. But more importantly, I think having customers who just have that frictionless experience to buy the service they want and attach to the service they want is extremely important. And it just helps the industry at large.
Sounds reasonable to me. So let's hear a little bit from the industry at large. We have time for one, maybe two questions if they're quick. So, sir, can you stand up and speak loud, project? Actually, here, let me hand you this.
This is Brent from Cybername. We are a DNS provider. We had a couple of customers move to GoDaddy because of the same reason that Mr. Arnold mentioned, because GoDaddy has a better way to integrate DNS, and that particular customer had multiple of domain names, and he didn't want to bother every time asking us. Even we were helping him, each time he preferred to do it himself. So I was trying to find out how can I integrate the same system. Now I learn about Domain Connect, and I want to know how can I onboard to that organization or as a DNS provider.
So I think the best way is to visit domainconnect.org, to take a look at the spec, take a look at the example service, try to do it. If anything is unclear, just come to any of us. I think we are always ready to help with onboarding for any of the providers.
Yeah, I think exactly, and I'll just build on that. The example service is live. It's exampleservice.domainconnect.org. It today will work with GoDaddy, it'll work with one-on-one. I don't know if you've onboarded those templates yet as your DNS provider, but the live DNS providers all support that service. The template is public, so if you want to implement the protocol as a DNS provider, you don't have to talk to anyone. You read the spec, you ask us questions, we'll answer the questions, and you can test it with the example service provider and get it to work. Once you have it working, then you know, at that point, you'd work with the community of all the service providers and just onboard the templates, and you'd be good to go.
Well, I regret that we only had time for the one question, but what a perfect way to end is the community saying, how can we learn more? How can we get this thing going? It really is a validation that the information that you guys brought here is useful and it's going to help move the ball forward for everybody. So I'd like everybody to join me in thanking Arnold, Pablo, Florentin, and Del for some great information today and a great panel. Thanks so much. Enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Take care.